ceasefire and calling for an end to the violence. Tragically, to some people, calling for a ceasefire should cease. And I'm just looking at these pictures, Ian, that we're playing. We've got pictures of that protest outside the Houses of Parliament. See crowds there waving flags.
To the right, 125. The noes to the left, 293. So those have it.
So let's bring...
I now call Ed Davey to move Amendment K formally.
Formally!
The question is that the amendment be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby.
So there you have it. That vote there, 125 to 293. But the key thing, Ian Watson, political correspondent who is still with me, is who from the Labour front bench decided to vote for that motion.
Yes, we won't have the names of those who have voted for that motion as yet. That will probably come in about half an hour or so when we see the voting rolls. But as I was saying, at least 5 Labour MPs on the front bench have said publicly that they are backing a ceasefire. It is therefore likely that all 5 of them have voted for this, and we expect others, perhaps around double figures, on the front bench. But just take a look at that vote, because 125 votes for an immediate ceasefire. That vote was obviously defeated, but given that this was an SNP motion and there are fewer than 50 SNP MPs, then this suggests that it had support also from Plaid Cymru, from the SDLP and some of the other smaller parties, but it does suggest there's been a substantial Labour rebellion. Now, many of them will be backbenchers, not frontbenchers, but it does look like there's been a substantial number of Labour MPs willing to defy Sir Keir Starmer's position, which was to instruct them to sit in their hands, to abstain in that vote, not to vote with the Scottish Nationalists, not to play their games, as Sir Keir Starmer would say. Sacked, so those who haven't formally put in a resignation letter can expect the other direction telling them that they're no longer going to be on the front bench. We think that's the case with Naz Shah, who made it clear during the course of the debate that she was going to be backing the motion on the ceasefire. That is the SNP motion. As far as I'm aware, she did not tell the party whips in advance that that's what she was going to do, and therefore we'd expect her to be sacked at some point this evening.
Okay, Ian Watson live from Central Lobby after that vote. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date. I'm sure we'll be with you later. Let's take you live to San Francisco, where you can see President Joe Biden sitting around a table with China's Xi Jinping. It's a bit of a shaky shot, but you can see them all there. And we've just heard that meeting, which has just got underway between the two powers, began with a short speech. We will try and bring you back to issues they will be discussing, including Taiwan and, of course, the human rights situation in China. The latest pictures from San Francisco as and when we get them. Now, let's get more now on the UK's Supreme Court ruling that the government's flagship asylum policy is unlawful. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, says his commitment to boats crossing the Channel is unwavering. Our Home Editor, Mark Easton, looks at the implications of today's judgment and what the government might do next.
How to stop the boats is by far the most pressing question for the Home Office. Until this morning, the answer had been Rwanda. Sources say there was a collective sense of shock at the department when the Supreme Court decision came through.
The court is not concerned with the political debate about the policy.
Well, that's as maybe, but today's court judgment implies that from the Prime Minister down, the UK continued to claim Rwanda was a completely safe country for refugees when there was ample and compelling evidence it was not.
British police have had to warn Rwandan nationals living in the UK of credible plans by the Rwandan government to kill them. In 2021, the UK government criticised the Rwandan government for extrajudicial killings, deaths in custody, enforced disappearances and torture.
Even after Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, signed the deal with the Rwandan government in April last year, Rwanda was sending refugees back to the country they'd fled from at risk of torture and death. A clear human rights breach, the judgment suggests, under the noses of British ministers.
That's based on a very careful consideration of the evidence that the Secretary of State and the government has and has had for several months.
One of the asylum seekers involved in today's case told me of his profound relief that he won't be sent to Rwanda in the foreseeable future.
What would you like to say to the judges who made the decision today?
I thank them from the bottom of my heart. It's the right decision to make, and they treated us with humanity.
So how can the government stop the boats now? Without the option of packing migrants off to Rwanda, the Home Office's plan in its flagship Illegal Migration Act simply won't work. The courts agree the principle of sending asylum seekers to a safe third country, well, that is lawful. But there'll be no flights of migrants to Rwanda anytime soon, nor anywhere else. The Prime Minister's promised new legislation, wants a new improved treaty with Rwanda, but the Supreme Court judgment warns that whatever intentions and aspirations Rwanda makes, the question is whether they are achievable in practice. The new Home Secretary, just 3 days into the job and charged by the PM to stop the boats, doesn't appear to have a plan B that can achieve any kind of result before the country delivers its verdict on the government at an election. Mark Easton, BBC News.
It's a busy evening of news here. Let's go back to another one of our main stories, the Israel-Hamas war. Israeli forces have entered Gaza's largest hospital in what the military says is a targeted operation searching for Hamas infrastructure and weapons. Well, our team at BBC Verify has been looking at what we know about the scale of the Israeli operation at Al-Shifa. Here's our special correspondent, Caroline Hawley.
Al-Shifa is the main hospital in the Gaza Strip, a huge complex with specialist departments. Its emergency department had only just been upgraded, with the Red Cross, which was involved in the work, saying it would support dedicated health workers to save lives for years to come. But Al-Shifa is fast becoming a symbol of this war, with all its suffering, claims and counterclaims, and a microcosm of how it's being waged. Now, BBC Verify has been looking at satellite imagery showing how Israeli forces have been closing in on the hospital. This is from Saturday the 11th. You can see them down here about 600 metres away. And then this is from yesterday. Here's the hospital. Up here and down there are Israeli troops, only about 300 metres away. Israel says it's a targeted operation to search for Hamas weapons and infrastructure. It claims there's a Hamas command centre underneath, though Hamas has always denied this. Last night, the US said it had its own intelligence that Hamas was using Al-Shifa for what it called a command and control node, which it says is a war crime. Let's now have a look at an animation released by the Israeli army late last month. It says there are tunnels beneath the complex and rooms, and one here complete with a carpet, chairs and a Hamas flag. Now today an Israeli military official said troops who moved in overnight had found weapons and what they call terror infrastructure, but they've not so far shown any evidence of tunnels. What the Israeli army has released today is these images of troops inside Al-Shifa. It says they're providing incubators, baby food and medical supplies, though the hospital says it doesn't need incubators but fuel to run the ones it already has. Now, these are the distressing images which have emerged over the past couple of days of babies whose incubators are no longer working. We've no information on how they are today. These photographs taken last week give a glimpse of conditions at the hospital then. Our Verify teams have been looking for any images from the hospital today, but almost nothing seems to be coming out, possibly because of very poor connectivity in the area. And the World Health Organization says it's lost touch again with hospital staff and that it's extremely worried for their safety and for the safety of all the hospital's patients.
Let's go to another developing story this evening at the British House of Commons, and that is that at least 3 Labour frontbenchers have quit after backing a motion from the Scottish National Party calling for a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Now, the SNP did lose that vote overall, but of course what we're looking out for is which members of the Labour Party went against the party line. Well, we can now go back to the House of Commons, to Central Lobby, and join my colleague, our political correspondent, Ian Watson. Ian, do we know any more about who else may have dissented?
Yes, we do. So my figure would be, or would have been, 5 at the moment, not just based on 3 resignation letters, but on 2 contributions in the House of Commons from shadow ministers indicating they would vote for the SNP motion on a ceasefire. And they've now been joined by the parliamentary aide to Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, Mary Kelly-Foy, who's also said that she is now effectively going back to the backbenches because she too voted for the SNP ceasefire motion. We may get a few more shadow ministerial names soon, but somebody who hasn't resigned and who is still very much a shadow Secretary of State dealing with science and technology is Peter Kyle. He joins me now, and hopefully perhaps he can help me with some of the numbers. 125 people backed this call for a ceasefire, the SNP motion, which Keir Starmer warned Labour MPs not to vote for. How many of that 125 do you think were in your party?
I don't know yet, because I've been standing here with you when the vote has been taking place. But what I can tell you...
We're both at a disadvantage, but it must be at least 50.
What I can tell you is that the previous vote to that was a Labour motion which called for the circumstances for a cessation of violence and the war, so that we can move to a political outcome, one that recognised the role of the International Criminal Court to judge whether international law has been obeyed, one that recognised the right of Israel to defend itself and secure its borders and work towards the release of those hostages. Every single Labour MP voted for that. Now, others went further because the SNP motion did go further than Labour policy, and if people were on the front bench, then of course they're going to have to leave the front bench to do so. But let's be really clear about this. Keir Starmer has been very consistent about this. We care deeply about the humanitarian problems, the issues, the loss of life, the civilian loss of life. It is heartbreaking. We want to work towards a permanent end to this war, to the circumstances where the cessation of violence can happen, so that we can move to a political circumstance. We're doing that with a resolute leadership, a resolute way forward, and a way which puts us in lockstep with our G7 partners, because only if we work together with our international partners can we have a hope of having the changes on the ground that we need to see.
We accept that you obviously want to work with your international partners, but we've seen President Macron now calling for a ceasefire, for example. We've seen various UN officials calling for a ceasefire. A lot of your MPs under pressure indeed from their constituents to call for a ceasefire. Presumably you understood that, but I know lots of negotiations took place yesterday to try to limit the number of people on the front bench who would feel the need to resign. That's why there's criticism of, for example, the siege conditions in Gaza, calling on Israel, for example, in your motion, to protect hospitals, areas of concern. Yet it simply wasn't enough for some of your MPs, perhaps around a quarter of the parliamentary party, perhaps between 6 and 10 front benchers, saying actually we believe Keir Starmer is not being strong enough on this issue.
Every single Labour MP voted for that, and yes, we do call explicitly for an end to the siege conditions. And every single Conservative MP voted against our motion tonight, calling for an end to the siege conditions and voting against what we call for the right of Israel to defend itself. But we know that every person who has struggled with this issue, we understand why. Because this is the strength of our political party, as a Labour party, that we have people from both traditions, both people who are Muslim and Jewish in our party. And Keir Starmer has led forward in a way that actually can tackle this issue by working with our international partners to bring pressure to bear on Israel to act with restraint, but also recognise that Hamas is a terrorist organisation, and one way that we could end this conflict really quickly would be for Hamas to release the hostages and then move towards a political situation. The reason we can't is because of that. Now,
We're stuck in a political situation here too, though, because someone like Naz Shah, for example, on the front bench said that she felt that you weren't being impartial enough. The wording of your motion does, it seems to me, perhaps you would agree with this, to be more critical of how Israel is now conducting its campaign in Gaza, but nonetheless she felt you weren't being impartial enough given the constant bombing, she said, of Gaza within an inch of its existence. Now, when people feel as strongly as that, is there a way back for them onto the front bench? Do you think that this is one issue where you'll say, OK, for now you've got to go, but we do realise this is just one very difficult issue and you can return in future?
You know, Ian, that I'm not a party manager or a whip or the leader, so I don't make those decisions. But I can tell you that we have real empathy for those people who have found this an incredibly challenging moment. Of course it is. Civilians are losing their lives. There is a terrible humanitarian disaster unfolding. We know full well that the quickest way to end this would be for Hamas to release the hostages. But that's why we're being very tough on Hamas, because they are the ones that are driving this. Now, also,
I don't think most people get that, but finally, because we're running out of time, I just wanted to ask, why didn't you back a free vote, as the SNP were calling for you to do so, and you wouldn't have had to sack anyone?
Because Keir Starmer has decided that this is the way forward. This is putting the country first, party second. That's what he's always said he'll do. He wants to be there, to be the Prime Minister in waiting. He wants to show the country what kind of Prime Minister he will be by always putting the country first and also working with our international allies. He's shown the resolution that we need from a leader at moments like this, but always acknowledging that this is a really, really difficult situation. Acting with empathy, but also resolution. That's what you get with Keir Starmer, but we will find a way through this, because ultimately we need to make sure we can work with international partners to get the humanitarian aid in there. So this is what Macron also called for, don't forget. He called for humanitarian pauses and then moving to a ceasefire. That's not dissimilar to the measure that we were calling today. The international community is pretty united on this, and we stand with them.
OK, Peter Carroll, the international community united, Labour perhaps not so, but perhaps around a quarter of your MPs dissenting tonight. Peter Carroll, the Shadow Cabinet Minister, talking at the moment about the situation inside the Labour Party, but also trying to highlight what Labour were calling for today. This isn't simply a party political matter. There'll be a lot of concentration on that too, but on the Labour position, which is actually critical of some of the conduct of the conflict, perhaps more critical than they were at the beginning of this campaign, talking about the need to lift siege conditions in Gaza, but not explicitly calling for a ceasefire, which has caused a rebellion and some difficulty for the Labour leadership tonight.
Ian Watson at Central Lobby in Westminster, thank you very much. Well, some breaking news. We've just been reading that 56 Labour MPs backed the SNP's call for an immediate ceasefire. So that's 56 Labour MPs who backed that call. And that includes Jess Phillips, who has resigned from her shadow front bench position. She's just posted a letter of resignation to Sir Keir Starmer on X, formerly known as Twitter. Let's read it out for you. She says, "Dear Keir, this has been one of the toughest weeks in politics since I entered Parliament. I tried to do everything that I could to make it so this was not the outcome, but it's with a heavy heart that I resign from the Shadow Home Office team." And she says, "I can see no route where the current military action does anything but put at risk the hope of peace and security for anyone in the region now and in the future." So a statement there, as you can see there, from Jess Phillips, who has resigned from her shadow front bench position. We can now go to Belle Ribeiro Addy, the MP for Streatham, who also voted against the Labour position and for the SNP's call for an immediate ceasefire. Thank you very much for joining us here on the BBC. Tell us why you decided to do that.
Well, I didn't vote against the Labour position. I abstained on Labour's position, and I was very clear to make sure that I voted for a ceasefire, because I believe that's the only way to stop the killing and the bloodshed that we are seeing. A humanitarian pause is simply not enough. I've had thousands of my constituents write to me, thousands of them write to me and tell me that they're in favour of a ceasefire. Nearly 80% of the country are in favour of a ceasefire. I don't believe any of us can sit there and watch what is unfolding over in Gaza and not immediately want to call for a cessation of all fighting.
Now, your party's leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has said in the past, while he understands calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that that is the correct position now. And he said that a ceasefire would in fact freeze the conflict and allow Hamas to launch attacks against Israel in the future.
Well, I think obviously everyone has been clear and everyone's united on the fact that they want to see an unconditional and immediate release of all Israeli hostages. But the fact of the matter is we're seeing thousands and thousands of innocent Palestinians, going to their deaths every day, hospitals being bombed, babies not being able to get oxygen in the ICU. It's awful. The fighting simply has to stop. And just because we don't think we're going to achieve it immediately doesn't mean we shouldn't call for it now.
Your party's leader, Sir Keir Starmer, does want to see a temporary humanitarian pause to address some of the concerns that you mentioned in terms of getting aid and health supplies to people in Gaza.
No, well, that's really important. We do need to see aid and supplies going to them. But that position, unfortunately, almost gives the impression that we're going to let some aid get through every once in a while, but continue the bombing. That doesn't make any sense to me. We need to stop the fighting now. We need the international community to rally round and work towards peace. And that starts with a ceasefire.
Where does this leave the Labour Party now? Because this is... even though you say you're not voting against the party's position, it is in some way a rebellion against what Sir Keir Starmer said was his position.
Well, this isn't the first time that members of a party have voted in a slightly different way from their leadership. So I wouldn't make necessarily too much of that. But people have been very, very clear as to what their stances. They've been very clear about listening to their constituents and the wider community. And I think at this point, it just leaves some of us in a slightly different position. But, as you said, everybody's united in wanting to see more humanitarian aid going into Gaza and an eventual end to fighting. We just seem to have different positions on how to get there.
Labour MP Bel Ribeiro Addy, who voted for the SNP's calls for an immediate ceasefire, along with a number of other Labour MPs. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. Just bring you a statement that we've had from Sir Keir Starmer, who says, after I regret that some colleagues felt unable to support the position tonight, but I wanted to be clear about where I stood, and I will stand. He said leadership is about doing the right thing. The statement continued, on the 7th of October, Israel suffered its worst terror attack in a single day at the hands of Hamas. No government would allow the capability and intent to repeat such an attack to go unchallenged. Since then, we've also seen an unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Gaza. At every stage during this crisis, my approach has been driven by the need to respond to both of these tragedies, to stand by the right to self-defence of any nation which suffers terror, and alongside the basic human rights and dignity of innocent Palestinians caught in the crossfire. That statement from Sir Keir Starmer. You're watching BBC News.
This factory is producing snacks eaten the world over.
Take a feel, you can feel the texture. It's really soft, yeah.
It's a fast business, with thousands of bags of snacks leaving the factory each day, straight to the supermarket shelves. Keeping all these machines going is vital.
In the process area, they are critical. When they stop, the whole line stops. And that's what we focus on, is where do we stop our, the V. If we look at the V curve, what stops our fryers, ovens, etc.
To try and predict when the machines aren't right before they break down, the factory's owners, PepsiCo, are turning to AI-powered sensors. But the secret ingredient is something the factory isn't short of.
All of these machines are really noisy.
Yes, they're listening to the sound coming from each bit of machinery and analysing the health of the equipment.
There is up to 4 sensors on every single asset, so you start to multiply that out. We've got a lot of sensors on our equipment. So.
And how do you find using them and using the reports they give us?
It's really a game changer for us. You know, PepsiCo are starting to get into that digitalisation world, and you know this is a major part of that for us. We're starting to change how we're working. We're starting to integrate the data. We're making decisions through data and analytics. Yeah, it's really taken us to a different level now.
Away from the noise of the factory, we can explore how it works.
At Augury, we work with the largest manufacturing companies like Pepsi to make their production lines and the machines they operate more reliable, more productive, and more sustainable. And we do this by basically listening to the machine, and based on the noise, we can tell you what's wrong with them. So we have our own sensor that we put on the machines, and we measure 3 things. We measure vibration, temperature, and magnetic emissions from the motor. And by analyzing this, we can detect malfunctions months or weeks ahead of when they happen. So this is what a normal machine sounds like. And this machine has a malfunction. Let's see if you can pick up what it is.
So it's much more high-pitched, but beyond that, I would have no clue what's wrong.
Yeah, so this is where kind of a sophisticated AI algorithm can really detect the specific issue that the machine has. Vibration and sound are physically the same thing, right? And we have today over 300 million hours of machines that we've analyzed and monitored. And we can leverage all of this database to create algorithms that know how to pinpoint the specific patterns of different malfunctions. So if you have, let's call it a bearing wear versus another type of fault, we can detect exactly what it is and tell you what you need to do to fix it.
Detecting the problems in this way means repairs can be scheduled and problems fixed without causing a shortage of products in the supermarket.
On top of it, we talk about sustainability, right? So if the machine is working in the most optimal way, you can reduce the energy consumption of that machine. You can reduce the waste that the production line manufactures by improving the quality of the products.
Tech in factories is constantly evolving, but in the case of these snacks, I'm okay with the taste staying the same.
Hello. An extreme and dangerous heat wave continues to grip parts of South America. On Tuesday, Sao Paulo in Brazil saw a temperature of 37.7 Celsius. That's a new record for November, just a shade below the all-time record for the city. It is also very humid indeed. A flow of winds off the ocean bringing a feels-like temperature of more than 50 degrees Celsius in places, including close to Rio de Janeiro. The heat is set to continue as well. We've got this band of showers and storms through parts of Paraguay and the far south of Brazil. To the north of that, the heat is allowed to continue, 42, 43 degrees across parts of Paraguay, parts of southern Bolivia into Brazil as well. But slowly we will see this band of showers and storms drifting northwards, and by the weekend that will bring a cool down for many. So for many cities in Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia and elsewhere, we've got a few hot days to come before things turn cooler and more unsettled. Now, it has been very wet in Florida. The risk of flooding continuing here, although much of the rain will be clearing. The flood risk then shifts to the Caribbean, parts of Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola seeing torrential downpours of rain, the risk of flooding and mudslides. It also looks really wet across large parts of Central America. And then these pictures are from central Vietnam, where we have seen relentless rain and significant flooding. These are the scenes from the city of Hue. And there is more wet weather in the forecast, although that situation should slowly ease. This is the satellite picture over the last few days. You can see cloud just ploughing into Vietnam. It is a wet time of year here, the northeast monsoon, but it has been particularly wet of late. Some places have seen 500 millimetres of rain in less than a day. The rain does continue for the next couple of days. It should then slowly start to ease as we head through the weekend. That's how things are looking around the world. Bye for now.
I've just spent the last 2 years as one of the BBC's Middle East correspondents. When news breaks, that's the moment when you can feel your heart rate starting to go up. You can feel the adrenaline start to pump. One of the things I love about my job is being out in the field.
From north to south, this is a country in shock.
On the morning of the earthquake, I was actually already in Turkey. I was in Istanbul airport, and I remember looking at my phone and seeing the notifications starting to come in and realizing that this was huge. For me, it's just about telling those stories, about making them vivid and understandable.
The scars run right across southern Turkey, the same desperate scenes in each town.
This was an entire neighborhood, and it's completely destroyed. It was hundreds of apartments, thousands of people. I've always really liked finding people and talking to them, like people's stories, because if I'm going to talk about things that some people live through, I think the best way is for me to see it and understand it myself. So what's happened is more and more people have joined this conversation at the building, and they are telling us that some of them lived here, they knew it was dangerous. Then when I tell you what's happening, hopefully you will have more faith in me to tell you that story accurately and impartially and in a way that really means something.
As fighting continues in Ukraine, join our team for the latest developments.
This car has been thrown against this building and there is shattered glass everywhere.
See the headlines as they happen with breaking news alerts in the app and get the full story with bbc.com/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
Hello, I'm Ben Thompson. You're watching The Context on BBC News.
The changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
I told Parliament earlier today that I'm prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships to remove the obstacles in our way. So let me tell everybody now, I will not allow a foreign court to block these flights.
He's wasted all of his time on a gimmick, and now he's absolutely nowhere. Will he level with the British public and finally admit he's failed to deliver on his promise?
UK plans to limit immigration hit a huge roadblock today as the Supreme Court ruled the government's flagship plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda was unlawful. But the Prime Minister says he will push ahead and find other ways to get the policy through. He says he's prepared to change UK law to do so. Also on the programme tonight, the latest from Gaza, where Israeli forces say they have found weapons after searching the largest hospital in the territory. We will speak to one of Benjamin Netanyahu's senior advisors. We'll also be live in San Francisco, where US President Joe Biden is currently meeting his Chinese counterpart, the leader Xi Jinping, for the first time in a year for talks over military conflicts, drug trafficking, artificial intelligence and trade. More on all of that coming up for you very shortly. But first, let's go to another story we're following within the last half hour. News that 5 of Labour's shadow ministers look set to leave Sir Keir Starmer's top team in what's turning out to be a big rebellion over his refusal to back a ceasefire in Gaza. They have all voted in favour of an amendment by the Scottish National Party. It's an amendment to the King's Speech that backs a ceasefire. Now, 56 Labour MPs voted for the amendment in total. Now, the front bench rebels include the high-profile Cabinet Minister Jess Phillips, Labour has ordered its MPs to back the party's own amendment that called for longer humanitarian pauses. They wanted them instead to abstain on the SNP proposal. So let's explain what's going on right now. Our political correspondent is Ian Watson at Central Lobby in Westminster. And Ian, this looks like quite a rebellion, doesn't it?
It does. I can update your figures actually, Ben, if you don't mind, but we do have the definitive figures for the number of people who are either resigning from Labour's front bench, from their top team, or have been sacked. There are 8 shadow ministers who are going, and 2 parliamentary aides are often regarded also as being on the front bench, the so-called payroll vote. One of them is a parliamentary aide to Labour's deputy leader, Angela Rayner. That's Mary Foy. Some of the names, no offence to them, won't be household names, but just for the record, I'm going to run you through those who have gone from Labour's front bench tonight because they voted for the Scottish Nationalists' motion backing calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The 8 shadow ministers are Naz Shah, Andy Slaughter, Yasmin Qureshi, Jess Phillips, that you mentioned, of course, Sarah Owen, Asfel Khan, Rachel Hopkins, Paula Barker, and the 2 others, the parliamentary aides, Dan Cairns and Mary Foy, who, as I say, worked with Angela Rayner, the Labour Party's deputy leader. So that is the definitive list, but that is not the full scale of the rebellion. Those are the people on the front bench, but a total of 56 Labour MPs backed the Scottish Nationalist Party's call for an immediate ceasefire. Some of the smaller parties here in Westminster backed that call too. Now, 56, just to put that in context, is around a quarter of Labour's parliamentary party. It's slightly fewer than some of those who've made their views clear through social media or through newspaper articles. That was around a third of the party, nearly 70 Labour MPs had done that. But it's clearly a significant challenge to Sir Keir Starmer, because the Labour leader had said very clearly to his MPs that he wanted them to abstain, not to vote on this motion by the Scottish Nationalists. He saw that as playing politics. But also there's extensive efforts over the last 24 hours to try to negotiate Labour's position, Labour's own motion on this, to try to minimise the scale of that rebellion. And it doesn't look as though that's entirely succeeded. But Labour, again, reiterating, of course, Israel's right to defend itself, to take on terrorists who threaten it, also was critical of the conduct of some of that campaign by Israel. It called for lifting of siege conditions in Gaza. It talked about getting fuel as well as food into Gaza. It talked about Israel having a duty to protect hospitals, for example. We've seen, of course, those pictures from Gaza today, and that the Israeli raid on the hospital in Gaza City. So Labour, to some extent, would be more critical to try to take on board the concerns of some of their MPs, some of their grassroots, some of those MPs' constituents, but it wasn't enough to prevent a significant rebellion, and probably one of the more significant challenges that Keir Starmer has faced since he became Labour leader and took over from Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, and Ian, those MPs will be very keenly aware of what their constituents are telling them and how they feel about what's going on in the Middle East. And we can look at a scene just outside where you are right now. There's quite a protest, a pro-Palestinian protest, outside of the Houses of Commons. So they'll be all too aware that they are accountable to their constituents, and that's perhaps why they have voted in the way that they have.
Well, that's right. I think some people really felt this is a major issue for many years. They've felt that the Palestinians have had a raw deal. They've felt that the peace process has been really very far off track, especially under the Netanyahu government in Israel. But others were certainly feeling the pressure distinctly and robustly from their constituents in recent weeks, and felt that if there was an opportunity to vote for a ceasefire, then that's something they had to do, even if they were on the front bench and they were risking their own jobs. So what we're seeing here at Westminster, just outside here, this very big, very vocal protest in favour of a ceasefire. There was many smaller protests or demonstrations or lobbying, call it what you will, outside MPs' offices, and some of those MPs felt a great deal of pressure, people writing to them certainly, but also pressure from some of their own membership at grassroots level. Some of them effectively articulating the view of one of the departed frontbenchers, Naz Shah, feeling that the party leadership was not being impartial enough on this issue. They wanted a two-state solution, Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state, but felt it had been too supportive of Israel's tactics, at least in the early days of this conflict. But yet certainly the pressure on many Labour MPs was huge. There was pressure the other way, of course, from the Labour leadership, and interestingly, Keir Starmer had allowed people to effectively freelance a bit over the previous weeks, so long as it didn't come onto the media and attack his leadership direct. But when it came to a parliamentary vote, his feeling was that he had to exercise some discipline. He says he regrets the loss of these front benchers tonight, but if Labour is serious about becoming a party of government, it needs to impose collective responsibility. That's why 10 of the front bench, 8 of them shadow ministers, had to go this evening.
Yeah, and Ian, that'll be the question, won't it? Just as Sir Keir Starmer was trying to get his party together to face an election in what could be a general election year next year, this is quite a setback to those plans. Where does it leave his Labour Party right now?
Well, certainly the line the leadership would take is that this is a particular issue where there are clear divisions within the party, exacerbated by events outside of their control in the Middle East. There are obviously people who have come back into the Labour Party since the Corbyn era, Jewish people, some of them supportive of Israel, not all. Others who are in the Muslim community, others from different political traditions within the Labour Party. And holding all that together in the face of this international conflict was always going to be a big challenge. But the view is that this is probably the biggest challenge, and on other issues they'll try to show more unity. Certainly, I think, from his point of view, he's been fortunate because of the government's difficulties over its Rwanda policy, over the resignation of, or indeed the sacking of Cyrilla Braverman as Home Secretary. That, to some extent, has overshadowed some of Labour's own internal difficulties. But those difficulties are not going to be resolved tonight. There are still going to be difficulties, I think, in Labour's grassroots. And I think it's difficult to bridge this gap. But again, from Keir Starmer's point of view, he would say, look, he's in step with the international community in this, calling for longer humanitarian pauses rather than a ceasefire. Others would say, actually, what do you call the international community? What about the UN? There are UN officials calling for a ceasefire. So this is something which I think is particularly challenging for him, but he doesn't believe it is a sign of wider disunity. What some of his opponents inside the party, though, would hope is that this has undermined his authority to some extent, and that people will be more willing to speak out against other policies that perhaps he's pursuing or policies he's ditching that they believe that Labour should keep, and that we might now see more dissent rather than the iron discipline that we've seen perhaps in the last year or so of his leadership.
Ian, really good to have you there to explain all of that for us tonight. Thanks very much. That's Ian Watson there, our political correspondent in Central Lobby at Westminster. Just to reiterate what you can see on screen, Labour saying 10 MPs have tonight been sacked from the Labour front bench. That's the opposition front bench after voting for the SNP amendment. That is one calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. There's an important difference in the language. It's about whether this is a call for a ceasefire or a call for a pause in the fighting. And that is the significant difference here. So Labour saying 10 MPs have been sacked for voting for that SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire. Labour had proposed its own motion that would call for a pause in the hostilities in the Middle East, and that they say would allow aid in, people to leave, rather than a ceasefire that could potentially give Hamas time to regroup. We'll have the very latest on that. If there are further developments from Westminster, we will head back there for you. But it's been a really busy day in Westminster because the Prime Minister elsewhere has said he will press ahead with plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda after the highest court in the UK ruled that the government's policy was unlawful. The Supreme Court found that there was a real risk that asylum seekers who were sent to Rwanda could be wrongly assessed and then returned to their country of origin, where they could face persecution. But Rishi Sunak said new emergency legislation will enable Parliament to confirm that Rwanda is safe, and said he remained committed to stopping thousands of migrants crossing the channel in small boats every year. Labour has called the proposals ridiculous and a pathetic spectacle. So let's speak now to Natasha Sangaridis, who's Associate Director of Advocacy at Freedom from Torture. Natasha, thank you for being with us on the programme. And you welcome this ruling today.
Absolutely. So today is a real victory for reason and compassion because, as you said, what the Supreme found Supreme Court found is what many of us already knew, that this cash for humans scheme is both immoral and deeply unlawful. The stakes could not be higher in a case like this. We work with survivors of torture who have been through the most unimaginable things. And every day in our therapy rooms, we are hearing of the absolute horror that this scheme has inflicted. But today's judgment really sent a very clear message to the government that Rwanda is simply not a safe country.
Wasn't the plan, the proposal, the whole idea of this policy that it would be more of a deterrent rather than something that would actually be enforced in reality? The idea that it would make it less attractive to come to this country, it would serve as a deterrent and therefore would prevent people coming here in the first place, hopefully not needing to actually be used in practice. And that deterrent idea is an important one, isn't it?
Yeah, well, look, we're all in agreement that really these boats need to be stopped. But actually, there is no evidence that the Rwanda scheme would indeed stop the boats or act as a deterrent. That's been very clearly laid out, even by the government's own advisors. And what we know is that the people up and down this country are seeing through the bluster. Caring and compassionate people now want the government to get a grip and scrap the Rwanda scheme. It really is not representative of the country that we are, and threatening to rip up every rule book every rule in the rule book is frankly terrifying and astounding.
The government says it will do the exact opposite to what you said some people are calling for. They will introduce emergency legislation to mark Rwanda as a safe country and therefore getting round this latest ruling. Briefly for us, if the government is going to press ahead with that legislation, that changes nothing right now, does it?
Yeah, and just quickly, it absolutely doesn't change anything because the Supreme Court, gave this unanimous, extremely clear decision laying out all of the reasons as to why Rwanda is not safe, citing extrajudicial killings and torture. So really, this is absolutely appalling that Rishi is now wanting to plough ahead. And I just want to add that this government has pushed through two legislations recently, both of which they promised the public would deliver. They are consistently failing to deliver because they are not being honest. This government, when it came into power, there were 7,000 people in the backlog. As of July, that figure rose to 130,000. They have wholly neglected the asylum system. We want and need this government to back down now and do what the majority of people in this country want, to scrap the scheme, to develop a humane, protection-focused asylum system that processes claims and deals with people with dignity.
Natasha, good to have you with us. Thank you. Natasha Sangarides there joining us to discuss the latest plans from the UK government as far as asylum seekers are concerned. Thank you. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
As the sun rises over the Caspian, get ready to embrace the day. Come and listen to the whispering sea make the most of Azerbaijan with its mountainous beauty. Just stop for a second. Take in the incredible landscapes. Experience them every way you can. Reconnect with nature. Set your spirit free. Azerbaijan. Take another look.
You experienced racism. Why didn't you walk away?
That's a really good question.
You're a politician.
I'm not a politician. I don't read the polls.
Yeah, you
I
are
sit
a
in Judiciary Committee. No,
you are very definitely a politician.
No.
The very fact that there were not people who looked like you.
Hold on. I'm only halfway through my answer.
Is secret schooling happening across Afghanistan for girls?
It does.
You simply can't assume that.
Actually, yes, you can.
Hard Talk on BBC News.
Now let's return to events in the Middle East, because Israel Defense Forces say their troops have found weapons, combat gear and technological equipment in the Al-Shifa hospital complex in Gaza after a long search of the complex today. Israel says that the Al-Shifa hospital compound conceals an underground command centre used by Hamas. It's a claim that doctors there deny. According to reporters that were among those inside the hospital today, the soldiers have left, but the IDF says that their operation is continuing. Tanks entered the Al-Shifa hospital complex in the middle of the night, and soldiers searched the site, interrogating patients and medical staff. There are reports from inside the hospital in the last few hours that the soldiers have now left, though we have not, of course, been able to independently verify that. Just want to take you straight to the scene. It's the UN Security Council in New York, and it's another vote tonight. There's a lot of votes going on related to events in the Middle East, but this is a latest vote to try to reach some sort of consensus at the UN Security Council on a humanitarian pause to allow aid in and people to leave Gaza. Now, you'll know that in recent weeks, since this conflict has begun, there have been 5 attempts that have all failed to reach a agreement, a consensus on what the UN should decree would happen in that conflict between Israel and Gaza. That vote is due within the hour. We will take you back there live if there are any further details. Well, let's speak now to Jonathan Panikoff, who's director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. It's good to have you on the programme with us tonight. And I want to talk a little bit. We've talked about the military operations. We've talked about the humanitarian crisis on the programme tonight, but to look at the longer term implications of what is going on there. And given your experience, I wonder what your assessment is of what is Israel's end game is in all of this, because we know that the rhetoric, the international condemnation is growing as the humanitarian toll grows. And I wonder how Israel will respond with an eye on an end game and how it exits this war.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you. I think that's really the big question that everybody still has. I think Israel's endgame still right now is very much dedicated toward ensuring that Hamas is decimated as a military group, as a militant organization, that its terrorist capabilities as a terrorist organization are no longer workable, that its command and control centers, including under Shifa, are not operational, that its weapons are largely confiscated. But that obviously still leaves a big question regarding what happens in Gaza next politically in terms of long-term security and, of course, the humanitarian situation. And that's something that I think Israel, the international community, including the US, UK, others, are all still trying to work through. I think there's a lot more questions still than answers about how you get past the military portion of what's happening right now.
Is there a chance of stability here? Where will stability come from? We know, for example, there's been a vote in the UK Parliament. There's also been a vote, or in the next hour, this vote at the UN Security Council. We know how difficult it has been for the international community to come together to agree a form of words and a form of recommendation for what happens in this conflict. What hope is there of any short-term stability here?
I think in the short term, you can have some. We're seeing the UN resolution that's calling for the pauses that Malta has put forth. I think that has a decent chance of passing. It's something that the US has also called for. That would allow humanitarian relief organizations and certainly the UN to get in water, food, energy supplies to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who do need it throughout Gaza. I think it would do so without ending, for instance, in the way a ceasefire would, that's been called for, Israel's views of its obligations to ensure its security and its protection by ending military force and by ending its operation. So I think it's a balance. I think it can happen, but I think it's going to still take a bit more time. The other question, obviously, is the hostages, because there's a question of stability and how the hostages play in. So short-term pauses might also give a window for hostage negotiations to not only continue, but for hostages to be released as well.
Jonathan Panikoff, good to have you with us, joining us live there from Washington. Thank you. Well, there is a key meeting that's underway right now between the leaders of the world's two major superpowers in San Francisco. For the first time in a year, US President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping are in the same room. The talks are part of the APEC summit that's underway in San Francisco. Topics on the table include military conflicts, drug trafficking, trade and artificial intelligence. But both sides have already set expectations pretty low, so don't expect America and China's many differences and disagreements to be settled this evening. Let's speak to our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue, who joins us now from that summit in San Francisco. And we said there, Gary, they've been talking down expectations already. There's a lot for them to talk about at this meeting, but looking at the agenda, they've only got 4 hours to do it. It's not a lot of time.
It's not a lot of time, but bear in mind a lot of the work is done ahead of these summits. In any case, they don't happen unless really there's something that's achievable for the leaders to deliver on. So I would expect something. It won't be very much. I mean, there's talk of perhaps some kind of deal on discussing artificial intelligence and what that can be used for, particularly in the military realm. And there's some talk of perhaps some deal whereby China may restrict some of the pre-chemicals that are exported to places like Mexico, which get turned into fentanyl, which comes across the border into the United States, which is a huge killer of young people in this country. On the other hand, the Chinese, of course, are looking for some concessions on the economy. Their economy is struggling at the moment. Foreign investment has fallen significantly. And to put all the icing on the cake, the tariffs that have been imposed and restrictions on tech imports are hurting them. So there's a lot of things there, some key strategic interests where they differ and they will continue to differ will also have to be discussed, particularly the South China and East China Sea. World policy issues, the war in the Middle East and Ukraine, those things are on the table as well. So it's a huge. And I think that the nature of what we expect tells you can draw the nature of what we're going to expect from the fact there won't be a joint statement after this, Ben. The Biden administration will do its own press conference. The Chinese will respond in their way. They don't expect to sort of publish a sort of joint declaration of agreements and a way forward. This is putting a flaw under the relationship, as one Chinese commentator said to me.
Gary, really good to have you there. If there are any more developments, we will be back with you. Gary O'Donoghue live in San Francisco. Stay with us. Headlines coming up for you next. See you shortly.
Hello. For some of us, today provided a bit of a break from all the rain we've seen of late. We saw some dry weather and some sunshine, but not everywhere. There was some rain around. This is how it looked for a weather watcher in East Ayrshire, and there is more rain to come. Our earlier satellite picture shows this shield of cloud now pushing its way in from the southwest. That's going to make for a very wet day, particularly in the south. During tomorrow. So through this evening and tonight, that cloud and rain will continue to journey in across the southwest of England, the Channel Islands, parts of Wales. The winds will pick up, particularly around some of the coast. Further north, a few showers straight across this east coast. We'll see a few fog patches developing, particularly in the north of Scotland, where we could see a touch of frost, but it will be milder by the end of the night down towards the south as this area of low pressure swings its way through. Now, the centre of the low is likely to stay just to the south of the UK, but certainly coming close enough to bring some very heavy rain, a really soggy start to the day. Also, some quite strong winds. We could see wind gusts of 50 miles per hour or a touch more around coasts of southwest England. The Channel Islands may be turning quite windy for other southern coastal counties as well. And this rain is going to be quite persistent through the day, only slowly easing off. We will also see this frontal system pushing in from the west, that'll bring rain into Northern Ireland as we go through the afternoon. Elsewhere, a few showers, particularly for northeast England, eastern Scotland. Some spells of sunshine to be had as well. But temperatures really will struggle, a decidedly chilly feel. Many of us stuck between 6 and 9 degrees. Now, during Thursday night and into Friday, we'll see these various weather systems clearing away. A brief ridge of high pressure, so this is a window of drier weather. Could be some fog patches around first thing, particularly across Northern Ireland, Northern England and Scotland. 1 or 2 showers can't be ruled out, but most places should be dry, although later in the day we'll see cloud and rain returning to the far southwest of England, where it will also be starting to turn just a little bit milder, and that sets us up for the weekend. Low pressure will be dominating the scene over the weekend. This band of rain pushing eastwards during Friday night and into Saturday. Lots of showers following on behind and quite a brisk wind. So a wet and blustery weekend in prospect, showers or longer spells of rain, but it will feel milder. Temperatures back in double digits for most of us.
All right, Gemma, at this moment, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder.
The UK's biggest cases.
Zara Alina was attacked by a stranger in Ilford.
Under arrest for causing death by dangerous driving.
We hear the stories of those who lived through them. He said he would be able to kill me, as told by the investigators.
There's no easy way to tell someone that their loved one's been killed.
And those left to pick up the pieces.
My last and my only memory is of my dad in a pool with his own blood.
The big cases. Watch now on BBC iPlayer.
As extreme weather conditions intensify, wildfires have been breaking out across the globe.
These are some of the worst wildfires this area has seen for many years.
For people in the area now, there is a lot of concern about how far and how fast the flames may move.
But the wildfire risk, despite the devastation in Lahaina, is far from over.
See the headlines as they happen on the BBC News app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.
This programme asks plain questions with the help of the unrivalled range of BBC journalists right across the world and gathered here in this building. I'll also draw on my time reporting on global conflict, frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to, meaning our analysis is unbiased with absolutely no spin.
Unspun World. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Ben Thompson. You're watching The Context on BBC News. The Israeli army carries out a raid in a part of Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa. We'll hear from an advisor to the Prime Minister. We're going to have more on that for you in just a moment, but let's get more on that breaking news this hour coming to us from Westminster. News that 8 of Labour shadow ministers will leave Sir Keir Starmer's front bench in a rebellion over his refusal to back a ceasefire in Gaza. 2 parliamentary aides, they will also leave. They've been all voted in favour of an amendment by the Scottish National Party to the King's Speech backing a ceasefire. Now, 56 Labour MPs voted for the amendment in total. Now, the front bench rebels included the high-profile shadow cabinet member Jess Phillips. Labour had ordered its MPs to back the party's own amendments, which called for a longer humanitarian pause. Labour wanted those MPs to abstain on the SNP proposal. So the language here is really important. The Labour proposal had been simply a humanitarian pause. The idea, a pause in fighting, a longer pause to allow aid in and people out should they need medical help. The SNP proposal was calling for an outright ceasefire. And we know that internationally there is growing condemnation, growing criticism of the rising death toll in Israel's war in the Middle East. So that is at the centre of these discussions and the votes. We know that tonight the UN Security Council in New York is voting on a similar proposal around the wording of whether it is a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. The UN proposal is for a humanitarian pause. Let's get the very latest, though, on what's happening at Westminster on that vote. Ian Watson is in central lobby for us. And Ian, you were just running us through some of the logistics and the details of how this works, but it's not a good night for Keir Starmer and his Labour Party as he tries to align his front bench to face an election. He's seen this huge rebellion.
He has. I think what he'll regard as at least a partial success is that the very top team, the people who sit around the shadow cabinet table, they've all stayed in place tonight. But he has lost 8 junior shadow ministers and 2 others who are parliamentary aides. So effectively 10 people have gone from his front bench. In addition to that, sorry Ben, it's been a long day, but in addition to that, 56 Labour MPs in total have rebelled against his position. That is more than a quarter of his parliamentary party. They've voted for this motion on a ceasefire, an SNP motion, which they were told by the party leadership not to vote for. They were told specifically to sit in their hands, not to vote for it, not to get involved in what they saw as a party political manoeuvre by another opposition party, and 56 of them have defied it. That's a measure of the pressure they've felt under in their constituencies or their own deeply held views that a ceasefire is necessary, and that simply calling for an extended humanitarian pause, for longer pauses, simply isn't good enough at this stage. That's the position taken by Sir Keir Starmer, but a quarter of his parliamentary party, some of those in the top jobs that he's selected, some of them politically quite close to him, have gone.
Yeah, Ian, I'm going to let you go and have a really good cough. And just while you do that, I just want to talk to people about those names, because you were running through those names for us. So the 8 shadow ministers: Paula Barker, Rachel Hopkins, Afzal Khan, Sarah Owen, Jess Phillips, Yasmin Qureshi, Naz Shah, Andy Slaughter. Those are the people who we know have now left the front bench. There they are. Those are the 8, and also 2 parliamentary aides. So a significant rebellion. We don't have the full details of the entire rundown, but this is an important moment, isn't it? And it really does underline the difficulty that politicians around the world have had, Ian, when it comes to coming up with consensus about what should happen.
Absolutely, and I think one of the difficulties, Ben, is this, that from Keir Starmer's point of view, the left of his party haven't liked the direction it's taken his party in. And what they've effectively done, is use this issue to some extent to try and undermine his leadership. But there are others, even that list of 10, that are closer to him politically, but have felt not just pressure from the constituents, but they're looking at the images on the TV screens, as we are, of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and have felt they can't quite hold the line. And to some extent, this is his problem. He's very much the victim of circumstance, of events outside of his control. And there has been, I think, some recalibration from his position initially, where people saw him as being very, very supportive of Israel, unsurprisingly, given that he wanted to distance himself from the previous party leadership over all that controversy over the handling of anti-Semitism in the party, but also given the appalling atrocities we saw in southern Israel. But as the conflicts progressed, there's been more and more pressure on him to be critical of some of Israel's actions too. He tried to do that in a motion that Labour put down tonight, talking about the need to lift siege conditions in Gaza, but some in his party felt he hadn't moved quite quickly enough. And now, of course, what he's effectively saying is, look, at least by calling for a humanitarian pause, I'm in lockstep with most of the international community, although other people will say, look, President Macron is going further in France, for example, or some UN officials also, but I'm in lockstep with the international community. But equally, privately, what the Labour leadership would concede is that whether they call for a ceasefire or not, that's going to have virtually no influence on Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, or indeed certainly no influence on Hamas. So perhaps it has got no practical difference, but I tell you this, it's nonetheless a major political difficulty for him domestically.
Ian, sterling work, thank you. Go and get a cup of tea. You've had a long day down there at Westminster. It's been a really busy night as well. Ian, thanks so much. And we'll let Ian off the hook, but a little earlier he was speaking to one of those shadow ministers who has left the front bench for Labour. That's Naz Shah. Take a listen.
Like I said in the chamber, and I'm really clear of everything that has been presented to me and the facts and from the NGOs, people on the ground, and watching what is happening. A child dying every 10 minutes, but just since those votes, we've had more children dying. And as one of my colleagues, Afsar Khan, put it, if we'd have voted for this yesterday and had a ceasefire yesterday, we would have had 144 children wouldn't have died. So every speech in that chamber today was very poignant about why the need is for a ceasefire. And let's be honest, we are not alone in asking for a ceasefire. In addition to the Pope, in addition to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the French President Macron, he has asked for it. There are many people, so we're not alone in asking for this ceasefire.
Now, your speech was very powerful. You talked about the bombing of mosques, of hospitals, of schools. It was obviously a very emotional time as well, but behind the scenes, in terms of practical discussions about Labour reaching its own position, which seems to me has moved to an extent, what kind of assurances did you get from the Labour front bench of what attempts were made to try to prevent you from resigning today?
Look, every move we have towards a better position is very welcome. I would have liked it to have moved further. I have made my position clear, as have many other colleagues from the Labour Party, as has the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, the Mayor of London, the Mayor of Manchester, the Mayor of West Yorkshire. We want a position to be an immediate ceasefire, and that didn't happen, so it didn't go quite far enough for us.
How difficult is this for the Labour leader Keir Starmer? Because obviously we think perhaps about 10 front benchers or parliamentary aides would have resigned. That's almost 10% of the payroll vote, so-called. But also, if you look at the voting in the SNP motion, I haven't seen the breakdown yet, but 125 people voting for it, that must be a lot of Labour MPs, perhaps 50 or so. That's around a quarter of the Parliamentary Party. That is quite a serious challenge to the Labour leader, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, it doesn't cause an issue for Anas Sarwar in Scotland, because Anas has called for a ceasefire and he will be voting for a ceasefire. So voting with the SNP isn't against what the Scottish Nationalist Party and Anas Sarwar are on the same space in terms of wanting a ceasefire. And Anas has said very clearly earlier on that we are wanting to get to a place where we can create the conditions for a ceasefire to exist, and he will be supporting that motion next week.
Very briefly, because we're almost out of time, do you think unless the party leadership adopts the call for a ceasefire, it will lose votes?
I think it is for some Lotto tonight, after seeing how many resignations and seeing the strength of feeling, will no doubt be having conversations, and the community will, speak.
Now Shah speaking to Ian a little earlier. We'll have the very latest on developments at Westminster. If anything changes, we'll take you back there live. But let's get the very latest on the situation in Gaza. We've been reporting, of course, that the IDF has been searching the Al-Shifa hospital. Israel Defence Forces say that troops did find weapons, combat gear and technological equipment in the compound, and they are continuing their search of the complex. Israel says Hamas has headquarters in tunnels beneath it, which they deny. In the last hour, Israel Defence Forces have released a video on social media that they say showed some of the materials recovered from an undisclosed building in the hospital compound. Now, we should be clear, the BBC hasn't been able to verify the video, but it is the first official IDF footage that we've received from within the hospital compound today. Have a look.
So we're inside the MRI center of the Shifa hospital. Israeli troops breached here a few hours ago, and we have cleared the area, make sure that it's safe. And a few of the most interesting things that we have found totally confirm, without any doubt, that Hamas systematically uses hospitals in their military operations in violation of international law. And what we have found, I think, is only the tip of the iceberg. Let me show you a few examples. Security cameras have been obstructed. All of the security cameras are covered, and this isn't the only one. You'll see the rest of them here. I don't know when it was used the last time, but it is definitely an MRI machine. And if you follow me behind the MRI machine, I'll show you what our troops exposed just minutes ago. In military terms, this is a grab bag, grab and go of a Hamas combatant. And if you zoom in, and we get some light over here, what you will be able to see is military equipment. There is an AK-47, there are cartridges, ammo, there are grenades in here, of course uniform, and all of this was hidden very conveniently, secretly, behind the MRI machine. On the other side, we found a backpack with what appears to be very important intelligence, including a laptop, and we'll show you that momentarily. We tried to uncover the cameras, but all of the cameras have been obstructed. You can see there's black tape covering it. And when our troops opened this closet here, which is in the main part of the clinic, this is what they found. The contents of the bag are full military kit for one Hamas terrorist. A live grenade, ammunition, fighting vest with insignia, boots, and of course uniforms, and last but not least, standard AK-47. Inside the hospital, hidden in a secluded area, let's have a look at what we found inside the very same cabinet. There's insignia, military insignia, a knife. For those of you who read Arabic, you'll be able to understand what it says here. But it's Hamas, the military wing, Kataib al-Qassam.
So that's the latest video we have from inside what we understand is the Al-Shifa hospital. It's the first official IDF footage that we've received, but we should be really clear, the BBC not been able to verify the video or what is in it. Let's speak now, though, to Mark Regev, who's senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister and former Israeli ambassador to the UK. Mark Regev, good to have you on the programme tonight. And let me ask you, first of all, about the hospital. What is the current state of the hospital and your operations there tonight?
Well, first of all, good evening, Ben. The operation in the hospital is ongoing. It's not completed, and I expect as it moves forward, we'll be showing you more material that will prove what we know to be a fact, and that is that Hamas has used the hospital as a shield for its war machine. I'd remind you that it's not just Israel that says as such. The Americans said so earlier this week. The Pentagon and the White House said their intelligence confirms what we know here in Israel, that Hamas has brutalized the hospital, has exploited it as a cover for its military machine. And more importantly, everyone who lives in that part of Gaza City knows it well. It's one of the worst kept secrets that they have. Everyone there knows that there is a Hamas military structure underneath the hospital. They just can't say so when talking to journalists because, of course, Hamas doesn't like when people tell their secrets, and they rule the Gaza Strip with an iron fist, with brutality, and people who speak out of turn against the party line will face violent retribution.
We saw some of what you say is evidence of Hamas operating within that hospital. Talk to me about what you say you found. What is it that you've discovered inside the hospital?
Well, I can't go beyond what the IDF showed in that video, but it's clear there's much more there because that was inside the hospital, and we know that the vast subterranean network is underneath the hospital. That's where the command and control is. That's where the network of tunnels that goes out to different fortifications, to missile launching sites, to arms depots. That's how Hamas built its struggle. We know that there is kilometer after kilometer after kilometer of underground tunnel network. One of the hostages, an older woman, 85 years old, who was released in the first week of this conflict, she said it was like a spider web of underground tunnels. And so we're facing a very, very elaborate Hamas infrastructure, military infrastructure there. And as this conflict continues day by day, I'm sure we'll be showing you more and more material.
Yes, and I wonder what happens next. So you say the operation is ongoing. If you get to a stage where you are happy that you have found what you need to find in that hospital and you have neutralised a threat from Hamas, that is your stated aim, of course. What will you do with the hospital? I assume your troops will leave, but will you commit to restoring that hospital to work as a medical facility, that it can care for people in Gaza who need to use it?
Look, when this operation is over, and Hamas will have been destroyed as a military machine and will no longer be in power in Gaza. That's our goal here. So obviously,
but that is a long-term ambition, isn't it? I'm talking about when you leave the Al-Shifa hospital in perhaps coming days, if you decide that you have achieved your stated aim there to get rid of Hamas within the hospital complex. Will you commit to letting aid in, letting power in, letting fuel back in, letting water back in, to return that to being a fully functioning hospital? Because we know it is not that right now.
Correct. Well, it's a combat zone at the moment. You're saying when it's no longer a combat zone, of course, Israel would have no problem whatsoever in seeing it be a real hospital instead of just a cover for Hamas's military machine. But when this is over, and we will win this war, we have no choice, we must win this war. I think ultimately it'll be better not only for the people of Israel, who won't have to live in fear of Hamas terrorists coming across the border to slaughter their children, but it'll be ultimately better for the people of Gaza too, who won't live under this terrible extremist Hamas terror regime. They deserve better too.
Mark, stay with us just 1 second. As we've been following on the programme tonight, there's a UN Security Council vote. We've got the results of that vote. The UN Security Council voting in favour of a resolution. This is one put forward by Malta. And once again, the detail here is a call for an extended and urgent humanitarian pause and corridor throughout the Gaza Strip. The UN saying that would be required for a sufficient number of days. It also calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. It demands that all parties comply with their obligations under international law and calls on the Secretary-General to monitor and report back on its implementation. So there, the top line, the UN Security Council finally, after 5 failed attempts, to vote in favour of a resolution calling for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses. Mark Ragev is still with us. Mark, your response to that?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the UN Security Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages. That has to be the basis of any moving forward. I accept that. We've already adopted a policy of humanitarian pauses, and we've done so in the past. We'll do so in the future to facilitate the aid coming into the civilian population of Gaza, to facilitate movement of people. We've had humanitarian corridors in the past. We can do it again. We have no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, we see that as augmenting our campaign against Hamas, because in parallel to the military effort to destroy Hamas, we want to do everything we can to assist the civilian population.
Yes,
but I want to point out...
And I just want to ask you about that, those efforts. And we know today that more fuel was able to get into the territory, 23,000 litres of fuel allowed in, but it is only being allowed in to refuel UN lorries. The UN says it's a fraction of what is needed. It is not enough and cannot be used to power generators at hospitals or to power water and sanitation facilities. The UN says it is appalling that fuel continues to be used as a weapon of war. They say our entire operation is now on the verge of collapse. Will you commit, especially in light of this UN Security Council resolution, to allow fuel in for power and to allow that hospital and medical facilities to get up and running once again?
So the decision today by government was to allow fuel for the trucks that are bringing in water, food and medicine to the people of Gaza. Other decisions on fuel is still under discussion, because for us it's a problem, because you say correctly that the hospitals need the fuel for generators, and we understand that, of course. And if we knew it was going to the generators, we wouldn't have a problem. But unfortunately, Hamas has had a track record of stealing that fuel and using it for its military machine. And Hamas is the only one in Gaza, much of Gaza, with guns, and no one can stop them. And in the past, there was a documented case 3 weeks ago where Hamas took fuel from the United Nations, and they take it for their tunnels, for their rocket launchers and so forth. If fuel is going to go to Gaza, we have to have guarantees and understandings that it's actually going to go to where they say it's going to go. Now, we're in discussions with different partners, the Americans, the United Nations, others, to see if it's possible to find safeguards. And if you can convince us that the fuel is not going to end up in Hamas's hands and rockets will be fired at Israel and they'll have lights in their tunnels and so forth, we're happy to hear your proposal.
Mark, as always, good to talk to you. Thank you for being with us on the programme tonight. That's Mark Ragev there, joining us from Tel Aviv. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the UK.
It's an investment which some hope will transform this part of Whitby.
This 2.3 million, I think, could change the way that people use the bridge, certainly how they use the areas around it.
These ideas and drawings have already been put forward by the council, with pedestrianised walkways aiming to make this part of Whitby feel more connected. As yet, though, nothing has been agreed, with members of the public now being asked to give their ideas as to how the money should be spent.
A general tidying up of the harbour side and the coastal frontage areas, I think.
To make the bridge a bit safer for people to cross and for pedestrians to cross over safely with children and dogs.
I'd have at least a dozen more sculptures.
The improvement work could start next year, a future that could now be shaped by those that live here.
For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
Welcome back. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Now, in the UK, inflation has fallen sharply to its lowest level in 2 years. Official figures show the rate at which prices are rising came in at 4.6% in the year to October. Now, you'll remember in November of last year, it was high as 10.7%. Now, at that time, the Prime Minister pledged to halve the rate. Rishi Sunak says that today's figure means he has delivered on that pledge. But Labour say it's not the time for the government to be popping champagne corks. So let's get some more detail on what it all means. We can talk to Anna Desmond, who is an assistant economist at Ulster University's Economic Policy Centre. Anna, thanks for being with us. So inflation finally heading in the right direction, but as we all know, it doesn't mean that interest rates will start to fall yet, does it?
No, we're starting to see another decision from the Bank of England in mid-December, so around a month from now. And expectations are that they, it might, mean a continued pause in interest rates, but it's unlikely that we'll see another cut in interest rates until 2024. However, on the tip of everybody's tongue is recessionary pressures there, and the question and around economic growth, which will definitely play into influencing the Bank of England's decisions over the next while.
So the idea that inflation is coming down, the government, Rishi Sunak, saying, look, I've met one of my pledges to halve inflation. He can't take all the credit, though, can he? Because a lot of this is, factors that he doesn't control. It's a lot about energy prices finally coming down.
Absolutely. So the sustained nature of inflation over the last 2 years has been largely down to global factors, fallout in the war in Ukraine, energy prices, as you mentioned, and food prices off the back of that also rising significantly, none of which have really been domestically controlled. So yes, quite a big stance there for Rishi Sunak to be taking credit in bringing down inflation within the UK.
And so with that in mind, although he has managed to halve inflation, the real challenge, the real work will be getting it down from where it is now, that 4.6%, to the target of 2%. Those couple of percentage points could be really difficult.
Absolutely. So working towards that target of 2% set by the Bank of England, the current expectations are early 2025. Some other organisations forecasting the end of 2024. However, this steep fall reported today will hopefully indicate that we're still moving towards that target, and hopefully, we can revise forecasts, perhaps maybe into mid-2024. But as you say, those final percentage points may prove stubborn to move down towards.
Anna, good to have you with us. Thanks very much, Anna Desmond there, joining us from Belfast. A lot for us to keep you up to date with this hour. I just want to recap the line that we had from the UN Security Council, because they've been trying since the outbreak of this conflict on the 7th of October to come up with a resolution, a unified stance or statement on the conflict in the Middle East. Tonight, we got that. The UN Security Council voting in favour of the resolution. 12 members voting in favour, 3 abstentions. They came from permanent members of the United States, the UK and Russia. Now, this proposal calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip. They say, and this is the crucial point, for a sufficient number of days. There's no detail on what that actually means in practice just yet, but it's crucially would allow aid in and people out of the territory. It also calls, an important point, calling for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. Now, Human Rights Watch, they have issued a statement within the last few minutes. They say that the UN Security Council has sent a rare and powerful message to Israel, Hamas and other armed groups that compliance with international humanitarian law is non-negotiable. An important point there. So we'll have the very latest for you coming up at the top of the hour. You're watching The Context on BBC News.
Hello. For some of us, today provided a bit of a break from all the rain we've seen of late. We saw some dry weather and some sunshine, but not everywhere. There was some rain around. This is how it looked for a weather watcher in East Ayrshire, and there is more rain to come. Our earlier satellite picture shows this shield of cloud now pushing its way in from the southwest. That's going to make for a very wet day, particularly in the south during tomorrow. So through this evening and tonight, that cloud and rain will continue to journey in across the southwest of England, the Channel Islands, parts of Wales. The winds will pick up, particularly around some of the coast. Further north, a few showers straight across this east coast. We'll see a few fog patches developing, particularly in the north of Scotland, where we could see a touch of frost, but it will be milder by the end of the night down towards the south as this area of low pressure swings its way through. Now, the centre of the low is likely to stay just to the south of the UK, but certainly coming close enough to bring some very heavy rain, a really soggy start to the day. Also, some quite strong winds. We could see wind gusts of 50 miles per hour or a touch more around coasts of southwest England, the Channel Islands, maybe turning quite windy for other southern coastal counties as well. And this rain is going to be quite persistent through the day, only slowly easing off. We will also see this frontal system pushing in from the west. That'll bring rain into Northern Ireland as we go through the afternoon. Elsewhere, a few showers, particularly for northeast England, eastern Scotland. Some spells of sunshine to be had as well. But temperatures really will struggle, a decidedly chilly feel. Many of us stuck between 6 and 9 degrees. Now, during Thursday night and into Friday, we'll see these various weather systems clearing away. A brief ridge of high pressure, so this is a window of drier weather. Could be some fog patches around first thing, particularly across Northern Ireland, Northern England and Scotland. 1 or 2 showers can't be ruled out, but most places should be dry, although later in the day we'll see cloud and rain returning to the far southwest of England, where it will also be starting to turn just a little bit milder, and that sets us up for the weekend. Low pressure will be dominating the scene over the weekend. This band of rain pushing eastwards during Friday night and into Saturday. Lots of showers following on behind and quite a brisk wind. So a wet and blustery weekend in prospect, showers or longer spells of rain, but it will feel milder. Temperatures back in double digits for most of us.
Say play BBC News to most smart speakers and you'll get the latest headlines and in-depth reports on international, national and local stories that matter to you. For your news when you want it, just say play BBC News.
Whether you're in Washington, Wisconsin or even back in the UK,
we take you behind the scenes, explaining US news, culture and the era-defining presidential election.
Americast, a BBC News podcast untangling America. Listen weekly on BBC Sounds.
Your favourite radio show is now available on BBC News, so join me, Nikki Campbell, for the nation's phone-in, talking about the big topics of the day, giving you a voice. No judgment, just honesty. Nikki Campbell. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Ben Thompson. You're watching The Context on BBC News.
A change is needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
I told Parliament earlier today that I'm prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships to remove the obstacles in our way. So let me tell everybody now, I will not allow a foreign court to block these flights.
He's wasted all of his time on a gimmick, and now he's absolutely nowhere. Will he level with the British public and finally admit he's failed to deliver on his promise?
Tonight, 10 of Labour's shadow ministers leave Sir Keir Starmer's front bench in a rebellion over his refusal to back a ceasefire in Gaza. Also on the programme tonight, UK plans to limit immigration hit a huge roadblock as the Supreme Court ruled the government's flagship plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda was unlawful. But the Prime Minister says he will push ahead. And we'll get the latest from Gaza, where Israel says its troops have found weapons in the Al-Shifa hospital complex. And we'll take you live to San Francisco, where US President Joe Biden is meeting his Chinese counterpart, leader Xi Jinping, for the first time in a year. To discuss all those stories tonight, I'm joined in London by Anna Michalova, Deputy Political Editor at The Mail on Sunday, and Chris Bruce, Political Director of the American Civil Liberties Union in Georgia. But let's start tonight with that developing story in UK politics. 10 Labour MPs have been sacked or have resigned from the front bench after voting in favour of an SNP amendment calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. It contradicts the party's policy on the issue. The front bench rebels included the high-profile shadow cabinet member Jess Phillips. She held a front bench position dealing with domestic violence. 7 other shadow ministers are also going, along with 2 parliamentary aides. Labour had ordered its MPs to back the party's own amendment, which called for longer humanitarian pauses, and they wanted them to abstain on the SNP proposal. Well, in total, 56 Labour MPs voted for the amendment. Well, the party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said in a statement, "Well, every leader has a duty not to go back to a failed strategy of containment and neglect, but to forge a better and more secure future for both Palestinians and Israelis. I regret that some colleagues," he said, "felt unable to support the position tonight, but I wanted to be clear about where I stood and where I will stand." Our political correspondent is Ian Watson. He has more on what the votes could mean for the Labour Party and its leader.
But it's clearly a significant challenge to Sir Keir Starmer, because the Labour leader had said very clearly to his MPs that he wanted them to abstain, not to vote on this motion by the Scottish Nationalists. He saw that as playing politics. But also there's extensive efforts over the last 24 hours to try to negotiate Labour's position, Labour's own motion on this, to try to minimise the scale of that rebellion. And it doesn't look as though that's entirely succeeded. But Labour, again, reiterating, of course, Israel's right to defend itself, to take on terrorists who threaten it, also was critical of the conduct of some of that campaign by Israel. It called for lifting of siege conditions in Gaza. It talked about getting fuel as well as food into Gaza. It talked about Israel having a duty to protect hospitals, for example. We've seen, of course, those pictures from Gaza today, and that the Israeli raid on the hospital in Gaza City. So Labour, to some extent, will be more critical to try to take on board the concerns of some of their MPs, some of their grassroots, some of those MPs' constituents, but it wasn't enough to prevent a significant rebellion, and probably one of the most significant challenges that Keir Starmer has faced since he became Labour leader and took over from Jeremy Corbyn.
So let's speak to the panel, and Anna's with us, Anna Michalova. And Anna, interesting one this, isn't it? Because it really does underline the difficulty that international governments have in being unified or coordinated in their response to what is happening in the Middle East. And this is quite a rebellion for Keir Starmer to be dealing with.
It is. I mean, to be honest, the shadow front bench, the people who quit the shadow front bench this evening, so around 10 at the moment, is not going to hurt him. The most high profile, of course, is Jess Phillips, which you know, to a lot of people is a shock because she's seen as a very capable shadow minister. Her brief has been to tackle domestic violence and that sort of thing, and she's very good on that. So I think that will be a loss to Keir Starmer's team. But beyond that, he's not really going to miss these shadow front benches.
But this is about unity, isn't it, Anna? Or this is about him trying to set up his front bench to take on a general election next year, and it's quite a setback to that, isn't it?
Well, in some ways it is. I think the more difficult part for him is the 56 in total rebelling against him. So 56 is a relatively large number. But in terms of managing his shadow front bench, I think in Keir's team, they're actually going to be quite happy with the result tonight because it makes him look strong, that he's pushing ahead with his line. They think it makes him look prime ministerial. And of course, they are continuing to try and draw the line with his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. So they see this as actually him showing that he is so different to Corbyn. He is so different to the Labour Party that was rocked by accusations of anti-Semitism that this is him being a hardline, serious politician. Lots of people will completely disagree with it, and lots of his Labour members disagree with it. I think, it's not just MPs. The MPs are expressing what they're getting in their inboxes. And some of these MPs who voted for a ceasefire tonight actually put out these letters saying just how it's, one of the most difficult days in their careers, and how they've been inundated with constituents who are begging them to try and do something. And there are others on his shadow front bench that did not vote, but also put out statements that they actually still back a ceasefire. They're just not voting with this particular amendment. So, yes, he does have a problem with party management, but it's not like he lost any particularly high-profile shadow front benchers. The top team has remained in place. Most of the people who've resigned are people most people have not even heard of. So I don't think he's particularly worried tonight, essentially.
Chris, let's talk about what we've also heard tonight from the UN. The UN Security Council finally voting in favour of a resolution. And this means they're calling for urgent extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout Gaza. I think by my reckoning, this is their fifth attempt to do so. But notably, the abstentions are the United States, the UK and Russia. And that tells us a lot about how difficult it is to get any sort of consensus back home. And it's just as true in the United States as it is as here in the UK.
That's absolutely correct. And I'm glad you're noting the abstentions from these three countries that typically do not align with themselves, too. The United States and the UK align with themselves plenty of times, but also with Russia, that typically doesn't happen. This is a very charged situation. And it's one that we have all been born into. And it's one that if we do not get it solved soon, it's going to just delve into worse situations. We do know that people are dying. There are Palestinians who are dying daily within this situation. And there are still Jewish people who are under attack. It's been charged, again, in the United States with President Biden asking for a pause, which now we're going back and forth over what's the difference between a pause and a ceasefire within it. So until all countries come together and put pressure on Israel and the people of Palestine to come up with a true solution to this issue, we're going to be revisiting it sooner than later.
Yeah, and that feels like the difficulty, doesn't it, coming to some sort of consensus on common language around this. For now, thank you. I want to turn to one of the other main stories that we're following for you on the programme. And that news today, again in Westminster, but the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak tackling illegal immigration a central focus of his government. But the big plan to stop the boats, in his words, has hit a hurdle after it was found to be unlawful. Under the government's plan, some asylum seekers who came to the UK would be flown to Rwanda. There they could apply for asylum or in a third country. Well, on Wednesday, the UK Supreme Court found that there was a real risk that asylum seekers who were sent to Rwanda could be returned to their country of origin, and that means they could face persecution, a process called refoulement.
The changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
Well, the Prime Minister says he will press ahead with the plans and that he'll introduce emergency laws to make sure the policy is not blocked again.
We have prepared for all outcomes of this case. And so we have been working on a new international treaty with Rwanda. This will provide a guarantee in law that those who are relocated from the UK to Rwanda will be protected against removal from Rwanda, and it will make clear that we will bring back anyone if ordered to do so by a court. We will finalise the treaty in light of today's judgment and ratify it without delay.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to Natasha Sangarides, who's Associate Director of Advocacy at Freedom from Torture, who welcomes today's ruling.
What the Supreme Court found is what many of us already knew, that this cash for humans scheme is both immoral and deeply unlawful. The stakes could not be higher in a case like this. We work with survivors of torture who have been through the most unimaginable things. And every day in our therapy rooms, we are hearing of the absolute horror that this scheme has inflicted. But today's judgment judgment really sent a very clear message to the government that Rwanda is simply not a safe country.
Well, that safe country line is what could be so important here. And Anna, the Prime Minister, has said he will change the law to define Rwanda as a safe country and then circumnavigate this ruling from the Supreme Court. But it's not that simple, is it?
No, it's not that simple at all. In fact, the safe country, I mean, on the weekend when I was talking to some people in government about this, one of them dismissed that specific route, which they have had legal advice on, as bonkers, because they say that it won't actually solve the problem, which is the risk of, once they get to Rwanda, of being sent back to the country they came from. That's the real concern. But the Prime Minister has announced two things. One, he's going to actually change the agreement with Rwanda, set up a new treaty. And the second is this emergency legislation, which will both designate Rwanda a safe country, but also try and derogate from human rights legislation, the Human Rights Act in the UK. So basically try and make it not apply to illegal migration. And similarly, to almost opt out of the ECHR for illegal migration specifically. This is something that ministers hope will work. And Rishi Sunak, importantly, has laid out a marker, and he says that his commitment is to get flights off the ground by the spring. Now, he's saying that if his current emergency legislation route does not work, that he then keeps the option open of actually leaving the ECHR. As anyone knows, that will not lead to any kind of instant planes flying off the ground either. So he's today, in announcing these measures, he's sort of talking very tough. He has certainly pleased members, MPs on the right of his party. They're saying that they're broadly happy with what he's announced. But he's given himself another very, very dangerous deadline of now the spring. And if a plane doesn't, it's going to be quite easy to prove whether or not a plane comes off the ground. Even if they succeed with this legislation, as we know, even deporting people is so difficult. You can get so many challenges that stop a single plane from leaving, that it's a really tricky situation for him.
Yeah, and the spring is interesting, of course, because that could be when the next general election is. He's setting out his plan to do that before we all go to the polls in this country. And Grace, talk to me about the parallels in the United States, because, is there anything that the UK could learn from what America is doing? We know that the migration issue, a really important one, particularly on that border with Mexico. There are so many parallels. And the point of what the government says its Rwanda policy here was all about was creating a deterrent, stopping people coming in the first place and only deporting them as a last resort. This was about saying, don't come here. And that's something that the Biden administration has been working on that Mexico border.
Yes, and I will start off with one of the things that the Vice President Kamala Harris said. She has gone to Central and South America and specifically told them to do not come to the United States. Now, I believe that what you were talking about, the parallels between the United Kingdom and the United States is, one, there's a reason why people are coming to these countries. So there's a reason why people come to the United States. There's a reason why people come to the United Kingdom. It's because they do not feel safe in their own countries. They are seeking asylum. So instead of trying to come up with different ways of deporting them, we can go back to the root problem of saying there are issues that are happening in these countries that have happened because of the policies of the United States. The United States have had policies of destabilizing Central American and South American countries, and that needs to be addressed. If we want people to stop illegal immigration, we need to go to where the immigration starts in the first place and stabilize those countries. I believe the United Kingdom has a history of colonialism. While they have backed off from that, these are the repercussions from it. So going back to these countries and making sure that they have stabilized opportunities for people will keep these people in these countries, and we can solve this issue so that it does not come up again.
To you both, for now, thanks very much. We're going to talk about the implications of what we've just heard for the Middle East as well in just a second, but around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News. Let's have a look at some of the other stories that are making headlines in the UK. And a city councillor has said that a tower block in Bristol that was evacuated over safety concerns was not built according to plans. More than 400 residents were forced to leave their homes on Tuesday, with the council declaring a major incident. Building surveys show that Barton House would not have been safe in the event of a fire. The French train maker Alstom has put more than 1,300 jobs at risk in the UK's largest rail assembly factory. That's in Derby. The site has no confirmed workload beyond the first quarter of next year due to a gap in orders. A spokesperson for the company says it's working to secure a sustainable future for the factory. And the Royal Mint has unveiled a new range of coins to celebrate 60 years of the James Bond films. Each design will feature a scene from a different decade from Ian Fleming's series. Well, the first coin is from the Sean Connery era and depicts the gyroplane from the 1967 film You Only Live Twice. More on those stories on the BBC News website. You're live with BBC News. You're watching The Context. And the IDF says its troops have found weapons, combat gear and technological equipment in the Al-Shifa hospital complex in Gaza after a long search of the complex today. In the last few hours, Israel Defense Forces released this video on social media that they say showed some of the materials that were recovered from an undisclosed building in the hospital compound. Well, the BBC hasn't been able to verify this video, but it is the first official IDF footage that we've received from within the hospital compound today. Well, Israeli troops raided the complex overnight in what they describe as a precise and targeted military operation against Hamas. Israel says the Al-Shifa hospital compound conceals an underground command centre that's used by Hamas, a claim that doctors there deny. Hamas is designated a terror organisation by the UK and US governments. Well, there are reports from inside the hospital in the last few hours that the soldiers have now left. We haven't been able to independently verify that either. Well, a little earlier I spoke to Mark Regev, who's a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister. I asked him about what the IDF claims it's found in the hospital compound.
Well, I can't go beyond what the IDF showed in that video, but it's clear there's much more there because that was inside the hospital, and we know that the vast subterranean network is underneath the hospital. That's where the command and control is. That's where the network of tunnels that goes out to different fortifications, to missile launching sites, to arms depots. That's how Hamas built its struggle. We know that there is kilometer after kilometer after kilometer of underground tunnel network. One of the hostages, an older woman, 85 years old, who was released in the first week of this conflict, she said it was like a spider web of underground tunnels. And so we're facing a very, very elaborate Hamas infrastructure, military infrastructure there. And as this conflict continues day by day, I'm sure we'll be showing you more and more material.
Mark Regev speaking to me there. And Chris, as we've said, the BBC can't independently verify that video that's been issued by the IDF showing those weapons found in the hospital. But if proven to be true, it does support Israel's argument that that hospital was being used by Hamas.
Yes, it would. And let's go back to what you said. The BBC or any other news organization has not been able to independently verify that. The IDF could open up what they're being criticized for as far as targeting civilians and everything else, and have independent journalists there to verify every move that they make. It is no surprise that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I can repeat that. Hamas is a terrorist organization, not only to the Israelis, but to other Palestinians as well. And they should be rooted out and destroyed, but not at the lives and cost of innocent civilians. Using hospitals is despicable. It is an international deal breaker when it comes to it. It is a war crime. And the Israeli government trying to seek out Hamas terrorists should be doing this in a way that minimizes as many casualties as possible. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of distrust that is happening right now in the Israeli government. What needs to happen is independent journalists, the United Nations, and other independent seekers making sure that this is done in a safe and meaningful and impactful manner.
Yeah, and it really does reiterate what we've heard, the change in language, Anna, that's coming from both the White House and also from Downing Street. Earlier this week, we talked, didn't we, about Rishi Sunak's comments, saying they must take all possible measures to protect innocent civilians, including at the hospitals. But this on the day that the death toll reached another grim milestone, according to the Hamas Health Authority, the Hamas-run Health Authority in Gaza, 11,000 Palestinians now killed.
Yeah, of course. And just to reiterate, you know, I also completely agree that independent journalists should be allowed in. And I think it would both serve Israel's argument to do that. And I think while it would be incredibly dangerous for journalists, you would find ones willing to do that. And at the moment, what we have is the only Western journalists allowed in have to be embedded with the IDF and have to show their reporting to it beforehand. So that slightly doesn't allow people to verify. But similarly, you know, it just shows the difficulty of this conflict, because you also quote the figure from Hamas, but those are also not independently verified. We're also relying on a terrorist organization putting out the casualty figures and what they're claiming. And of course, you know, that there's a lot of rightfully mistrust on what's coming out of Gaza. But I think, you know, if you look at the British politicians' line this evening, it continues to be quite strong. Grant Shapps, who's the recently anointed Defense Secretary, said that Israel has an absolute right to be doing this, to be doing what it's doing, and that if Britain, for example, had been attacked as Israel had been on the 7th of October, no one will be questioning these actions here.
Yes, Anna, Chris, for now, thank you, because I just want to look at something entirely different. But let's take you to the US, because it's now becoming a familiar tale, isn't it? Last night, the US House of Representatives passed a temporary spending bill, averting a government shutdown just days before it was due. It means the can, once again, kicked down the road. While the stopgap bill continues government funding at current levels until mid-January. It was, of course, though, the first big challenge for new House Speaker Mike Johnson, who's been in the job little under a month. Now, he needed the support of Democrats to see the bill passed. He got it in the 336 votes in favour. 209 were Democrat. Meanwhile, 93 of his fellow Republicans opposed the bill. Now, if it sounds like something you've heard before, you'd be right. It's because we have, nearly. Mike Johnson's predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, was ousted from the job as a result of a spending bill that he passed to avoid an earlier government shutdown. That vote, too, had the support of Democrats, and it's its cooperation that's also turn on him. So what exactly is Mike Johnson doing differently to make it work? Chris, let me ask you that. What is he doing differently to get this through?
Well, Mike Johnson, being new to the scene, has a breath of fresh air, working with Democrats, Republicans all across the spectrum. But let me start off by saying this is not how government works at all. Any government across the United States, the world, anywhere, you should not be kicking the can down the road of saying who is going to be ready when it comes to spending in our defense. Missing from that measure is spending towards Israel and Ukraine. Two priority projects of the United States when it comes to national security, not only in the United States, but abroad. When it comes down to it, this is an election year coming up. Republicans are in charge of the House, and which means that bills should be originating from the House. This is a problem. Now, I hope the American people, as well as the world, are paying attention of a party that does not know what they are doing. They cannot coalesce around each other to lead within this country. And other Democrats are looking at them and saying, why are you in power? While, again, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats had the same margin before that the Republicans have now. So this is about leadership. And within leadership, there are people who are paying and are uncertain about the future in the United States. And that should never happen.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see what once again happens, as you said, pushing the can down the road. And he doesn't have much wiggle room either, does he, Chris, briefly? I'm just looking here. He can only afford to lose 3 Republican votes on any legislation that the Democrats oppose. He hasn't got a lot of room to manoeuvre.
Oh, he doesn't. Absolutely not. And let's be clear, the same proponent and same law and bill that ejected the last speaker is also in place.
Yeah.
So anyone at any time can introduce a measure on the floor to get rid of the speaker as well.
Yeah. Chris, good to have you with us. Chris, Anna, we'll talk some more in just a moment. You're watching The Context on BBC News. Stay with us.
Hello. For some of us, today provided a bit of a break from all the rain we've seen of late. We saw some dry weather and some sunshine, but not everywhere. There was some rain around. This is how it looked for a weather watcher in East Ayrshire, and there is more rain to come. Our earlier satellite picture shows this shield of cloud now pushing its way in from the southwest. That's going to make for a very wet day, particularly in the south. During tomorrow. So through this evening and tonight, that cloud and rain will continue to journey in across the southwest of England, the Channel Islands, parts of Wales. The winds will pick up, particularly around some of the coast. Further north, a few showers straight across this east coast. We'll see a few fog patches developing, particularly in the north of Scotland, where we could see a touch of frost, but it will be milder by the end of the night down towards the south as this area of low pressure swings its way through. Now, the centre of the low is likely to stay just to the south of the UK, but certainly coming close enough to bring some very heavy rain, a really soggy start to the day. Also, some quite strong winds. We could see wind gusts of 50 miles per hour or a touch more around coasts of southwest England, the Channel Islands, maybe turning quite windy for other southern coastal counties as well. And this rain is going to be quite persistent through the day, only slowly easing off. We will also see this frontal system pushing in from the west. That'll bring rain into Northern Ireland as we go through the afternoon. Elsewhere, a few showers, particularly for northeast England, eastern Scotland. Some spells of sunshine to be had as well. But temperatures really will struggle, a decidedly chilly feel. Many of us stuck between 6 and 9 degrees. Now, during Thursday night and into Friday, we'll see these various weather systems clearing away. A brief ridge of high pressure, so this is a window of drier weather. Could be some fog patches around first thing, particularly across Northern Ireland, Northern England and Scotland. 1 or 2 showers can't be ruled out, but most places should be dry, although later in the day we'll see cloud and rain returning to the far southwest of England, where it will also be starting to turn just a little bit milder, and that sets us up for the weekend. Low pressure will be dominating the scene over the weekend. This band of rain pushing eastwards during Friday night and into Saturday. Lots of showers following on behind and quite a brisk wind. So a wet and blustery weekend in prospect, showers or longer spells of rain, but it will feel milder. Temperatures back in double digits for most of us.
The world is changing around us, and it's changing fast. On Future Earth, we'll investigate the biggest climate stories of our time, and we'll analyze why they matter. And we'll reveal the actions you can take to help protect our planet.
Join Carl Nasman for Future Earth. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Margaret Atwood, welcome to This Cultural Life. Some of the world's leading artistic figures reveal to me their influences.
Music is part of our culture, dance is part of our culture.
And the experiences that have inspired their own work.
The people around me never said you can't do this.
I was totally in love with Monk.
Now I'm blushing. Find out what fires the creative imagination with John Wilson. This Cultural Life. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
This programme asks plain questions with the help of the unrivalled range of BBC journalists right across the world. And gathered here in this building, I'll also draw my time reporting on global conflict and meeting countless heads of government. Frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to, meaning our analysis is objective, unbiased, and I promise you with absolutely no spin. That's why we call our programme Unspun World.
Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Ben Thompson. You're watching The Context on BBC News. President Biden welcomes the Chinese leader Xi Jinping for rare talks near San Francisco. Let's talk about that right now, because for the first time in a year, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping has met face-to-face with President Biden for talks in San Francisco. Well, the meeting marks a renewed attempt to stabilise relations between the US and China after years of rising tensions. It's only the second time the pair have met since Biden became US president in 2021. And there's plenty for them to discuss, issues like artificial intelligence, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and, of course, the Israel-Gaza war. The two leaders are also expected to agree on steps to crack down on the flow of fentanyl from China to the United States. But going by what we've been hearing from US officials, one major goal might just simply be improving communication. Live now to San Francisco, we can speak to Sumi Somaskanda. The White House, Sumi, has been playing down expectations, haven't they, tonight, about what we can expect, and looking at it, just 4 hours in the diary for this meeting. But it's an important meeting nonetheless, isn't it?
Ben, that's absolutely right. This is being called an extremely significant meeting, but they're talking about reestablishing a line of communication, not only between President Biden and President Xi at the very highest level, but also from military to military. If you remember, back in February, there was this accusation from the U.S. that China had flown a spy balloon over the country. The U.S. then shooting down the spy balloon. The Chinese rejected all of those accusations. And at that time, the U.S. military tried to call China and nobody picked up. And that was a source of great consternation here in the U.S. If there were to be a similar source of tension in the future, who do we call? Is someone going to pick up on the other end? So that is the baseline of what they are discussing. About 30 minutes from here at a private estate where Presidents Biden and Xi are meeting, as you said, for about 4 hours. We are expecting to see President Biden come out afterwards and give a press conference, give us an idea if there is some outcome. But going into the meeting, he did say there is no substitute for face-to-face discussions. And he said, we want to make sure that this competition does not veer into conflict. So again, laying out what the expectations might be. Now, we were able to speak a little bit earlier to the principal deputy spokesperson for the State Department, Vedant Patel. This is what he told us about the meeting. Vedant, we saw the U.S. president say this bilateral meeting is about reestablishing contact between the two countries, especially military to military. Beyond that, what would be considered a success?
Well, the important thing to remember is that we have long talked about taking steps to constructively stabilize the relationship, have some stability. We believe that that is something that is not just in the interest of our two countries, but it is something that the international community expects. When we talk about some of these key issues, like addressing that climate cooperation, counter-narcotics, these are things that will benefit the people of both of our countries, but also these are areas where the United States and the People's Republic of China are important players. And if we want to see progress in those spaces, it requires both of our countries to work collaboratively.
When it comes to military communication, what is the concern there, that this relationship could really veer into conflict?
Of course, we have long talked about how this is an area that we think can help minimize conflict, create some stability, create avenues for communication to address any potential misunderstanding.
If you look at what the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in the lead up to the meeting, he said President Biden is coming to this meeting in a position of strength, economic strength. On the other hand, we've seen China's economy has slowed significantly. Is there a sense in the U.S. that may lay fertile ground for more agreement between these two countries?
I couldn't agree more with what National Security Advisor Sullivan said. That's what we believe, that President Biden is coming into the summit from a position of strength. This has started, really, the groundwork that has been laid for this began in Anchorage at the beginning of this administration, of that bilateral meeting between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary Blinken, and their PRC counterparts. It continued on with an engagement by Secretary Blinken in Beijing, and we've continued to see high-level travel from both sides across the Pacific talking about these really important issues.
One conflict that is expected to be discussed is the Israel-Gaza war at the moment. We've seen the White House say that they know China does have ties to Iran. What concretely does the U.S. want to see China do vis-a-vis Iran?
We have been clear to any country as it relates to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East that those who have a role to play, those who have purported influence or relationships with some of the many malign actors in the region, that they send a clear message that we, the United States, are not interested in seeing this conflict spread. No other malign actors, no other terrorist groups should use this opportunity to further prey on Israel. So that's a message that you saw Secretary Secretary Blinken carry throughout his travels in the region, and it's something that you'll hear us echo again to countries.
So the point is to get China to relay that message as well to Iran?
It is a message we're sharing with all countries, that we are not interested in seeing this conflict spread, and that any role that you have to play in doing that, it needs to be done.
We know at the moment that Taiwan remains a source of tension between the U.S. and China. And we saw a report from Reuters quoting a senior Taiwanese official saying that Taiwan wants a one-on-one meeting with President Biden during the summit. Is that something that would be considered, or could it derail any sense of progress in a meeting between the two presidents?
Well, I'm just not going to speak about the president's schedule, and we'll, of course, let our White House colleagues speak to that. The important thing to remember, and this is something that we've been consistent about, and we expect, I know that President Biden will be consistent about as well, is that the United States is not interested in changing the status quo. We continue to affirm our one China policy. We are not for Taiwan independence, and that will continue to be the case. We're not interested in changing the status quo.
There are, however, elections coming up in Taiwan. They're going to be watched very closely. We've heard concerns from the U.S. that they don't want to see any Chinese interference in these elections. Is that a message that will be directly relayed during the course of the summit?
Democracy and governance issues, I have no doubt, will come up. Of course, though, we'll let the summit play out before we speak to it specifically.
What would the U.S. reaction be to any sort of, what would the U.S. be relaying as to what the U.S. reaction would be?
To take a step back, in any election around the world, we have been clear-eyed about the fact that what we want to see is a free and fair election that is reflective of the will of the people participating in that election. That's going to continue to be the case. That's what we want to see, whether it be in any country of the world, and we want to see it free of malign influence, see it free of any disinformation efforts and things like that.
One more big picture question on the U.S.-China relationship. Coming into the summit, we've seen President Biden saying that he does see China as a threat to the rules-based international order that the U.S. wants to see prevail. We have also seen President Biden and Secretary Blinken strengthening ties in the region with partners in the region. Can there really be a marked improvement in the relationship?
When we talk about our approach to the People's Republic of China, one thing that you have heard President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and others talk about is this idea of investing, aligning, and competing. And that middle word, aligning, has been so key. And that's something that Secretary Blinken has been working around the clock with, engaging with partner countries to deepen our partnerships with countries who share our vision for a free and rules-based world, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but around the planet. And that's something that we're going to continue to work towards.
And Sumi, the thing that strikes me in all of these negotiations and this meeting is that rhetoric around it, that this isn't really about making the relationship better. It's about just making sure it doesn't get any worse.
That's exactly the message that we've heard from the White House, even from the president himself. They have referred to this as putting guardrails or a floor on the relationship. And one important reason for that we have to keep in mind is there are elections here in the U.S. coming next year. President Biden knows well that he will not be able to meet face-to-face with President Xi in the coming year. And the White House has said it wants to make sure that those lines of communication that we were discussing, that those are open. If there is to be some further conflict in this coming year, these two leaders will not be able to meet face-to-face again. And he wants to know that he'll be able to pick up the phone and call President Xi to ensure that these tensions do not spiral into conflict. That being said, we know that there are significant points of tension, Ben. Everyone knows Taiwan is a point of tension. South China Sea, also trade at the moment is as well. So they're looking for these tiny pieces of progress that have been mentioned on artificial intelligence, on cracking down on fentanyl production, and on climate change as well, and hoping that these sweeteners, as they're being called here, will be some sign of progress and goodwill towards putting that floor on the relationship.
Sumi, really good to have you with us tonight. Thanks very much joining us live from San Francisco. Thank you. Well, let's talk to the panel. And Anna, interesting, all of the kind of words that we hear around meetings like this. It's just a short meeting, but some suggestions as well that this is just about reassuring the UK's, China's and the US's allies in all of this. And that's what's interesting, isn't it? How the rest of the world will see this meeting as opposed to the two men meeting themselves.
Well, UK politicians will certainly be watching closely, and I think the US has definitely set the tone when it comes to China for the UK in a lot of ways with foreign policy in the last few years. There is another element here which will feed in an interesting way, which is